Then sort of the data behind that. This was a really cool study that was done. So to back up there, it's sort of routinely very difficult to do nutrition studies because just like we talked about before, we're all very different in how we metabolize food. So it gives one person, two people the exact same meal intake, their bodies are going to process those things very differently based on all those things we talked about before: genetics, epigenetics, medications, microbiome, everything. But this study was sort of as close as we were going to get to be able to look at that. And so to be able to account for all of those things, these patients were kept in a inpatient setting so they could measure and monitor everything. They were 2 weeks on a minimally processed diet and 2 weeks on an ultra processed diet. And these diets were matched for macronutrients and micronutrients. And they weren't told to eat less or more, but they measured sort of how much people ate when they ate more and sort of how quickly they ate. And what they found is, in addition to sort of this data, the patients that were in when they were, and they did them as a crossover, so they would do 2 weeks of one thing, 2 weeks of the other. And so what they found was the patients that went from the minimally processed to the ultra processed, they tend to eat faster, which correlated to what we talked about earlier with those processed foods being sort of very palatable, which means they are easier to chew. They're usually softer, which correlates to you being able to eat more of them. They ate a little bit quicker as well because if you think about it, it takes a little bit longer to chew an apple versus, a potato chip. And they also they found those patients ate more calories when they were on the ultra processed versus the unprocessed. My joke to patients is if you try to sit and eat 5 apples, you won't be able to do it because of how much fiber you're going to get in that apple. And they also found, so the things they found sort of that were pretty remarkable in sort of the labs itself are ghrelin, we talked about, right? And ghrelin is that hunger hormone. And we see that it's higher in that ultra processed versus the unprocessed diet. So what is ghrelin? It's a hunger hormone that makes you more hungry. And then we saw insulin levels. Insulin is important because we don't want patients to have insulin resistance and start to have a diagnosis of pre-diabetes and then diabetes. In just that 2 week period, we saw patients that had an increased level number for insulin in the ultra processed versus the unprocessed. And again, just in 2 weeks, we saw changes in total cholesterol and LDL, and also CRP, which is at the bottom here, which you can't see real well, but that's an inflammatory marker, which we talked about with those emulsifiers causing those sort of breaks in that mucosa. We see changes even in that CRP, which is that inflammatory marker. So this was sort of kind of gave us a nice glimpse of what processed food and emulsifiers do to your body sort of overall. We also saw increases in weight in just that 2 week period in patients that moved from the minimally processed to the ultra processed. And so this is sort of just more data that we're getting over and over again and get patients sort of to reduce that processed food. And then when we talk about we talk about trying to reduce all those things we talked about before with those sort of metabolic consequences of excess weight. And we also, of course, want to come to reduce people's risk of cancer. And so the American Cancer Society guidelines from, I think they were last year, 2021, for physical activity and healthy eating patterns. And so we could talk for days about all the studies that have come out for eating patterns and Mediterranean diet versus plant-based versus vegan versus flexitarian. There's tons of data, but most of it boils down to a little of what you see by the American Cancer Society guidelines. We want patients to have a variety of vegetables. So multiple colors, you see dark green, red, orange, fiber rich, many different types of vegetables every day, legumes like beans and peas, more fruits and more whole fruits with a multitude of colors and whole grains. And we also want our patients to limit red and processed meats. For me as a gastroenterologist, I want them to reduce it because I know that increases your risk for colon cancer. Sugar sweetened beverages, because I know that increases patients' risk for fatty liver disease that ends up in cirrhosis down the line and diabetes. And then highly processed foods and refined grain products. Again, going back to what we talked about before with those emulsifiers causing a lot of GI symptoms, but also being carcinogenic from the American Cancer Society guidelines. And so this is sort of that general guideline that we'll see from sort of most studies will guide you to eating more of a whole foods diet, getting rid of those processed foods and sugary beverages and sort of processed meats and sort of eliminating sort of that meat intake, right? So that's what you will see sort of across the line for most studies. And so we won't go into all those studies today so we can get to some of these things that you may not have known about, but that is sort of the general consensus. And then getting people to understand what actually is a serving size, right? And so getting patients, if you are eating meat, for example, sort of 3 to 4 ounces of lean meat, whereas I tell patients to think about it when you go to a steak restaurant and they sort of tell you about your specials, they always are so proud to tell you that they have a 10, 12-ounce special. That's your steak, right? And people take that and we're like, oh, great, that's amazing. Of course I want that. But that's actually that's enough for 3 people technically, right? And so then they give you sort of maybe a big, huge thing of mashed potatoes and then maybe 2 or 3 asparagus. So we get into our brains that these are portion sizes. So most patients will say, of course I eat vegetables, but are you having a serving of vegetables? Because the 2 asparagus on top of your 12 ounces of steak is not a serving. And so getting people just to think about how much they're actually getting in and being sort of honest with themselves, but actually knowing what that means. What is a serving size? And this is sort of a general from Harvard, sort of the general healthy eating plate idea. So instead of trying to go and measure food and think about sort of all and sort of getting cups and these sort of things for eating, I try to get people to think about sort of how to just proportion your plate. And so doing these small things will help with caloric intake and help with sort of reducing sort of how much you're getting in every day by just thinking. I try to tell patients to think about a half of your plate being vegetables, right? So an entire half of your plate. And here they have vegetables and some fruit. That's also great because that's going to be increased fiber. And then a fourth of your plate being whole grains, and then a fourth of your plate being some type of healthy protein, whether that be, and remembering other sources of protein being things like beans or chickpea pastas. These are all sort of other good sources of protein, or sort of having that lean fish or poultry are some of the things they sort of recommend here because we know all patients are not going to go plant-based. So we try to reduce how much of that we're getting in. And again, avoiding sort of and limiting sort of red meat, sort of the processed meats, bacon, sausage, cold cuts, those sorts of things. And then getting people to drink more water. It's surprising how many patients do not drink water every single day, how much tea and juice and coffee and sodas that people are getting in every day. So trying to get patients to drink more water. It's amazing how patients will say how much better they feel just simply by drinking more water. And then thinking about sort of how much oil and butter we're using and sort of in thinking and getting away from us a little bit when we're sauteing our vegetables or when we're making salad dressings and just thinking about that a little bit more. And that again goes alongside with sort of portion control and portion sizes. Then the next big thing is food labels. Most patients only look at sort of the caloric intake, and that's how they determine whether something is good or bad, right? Or carbs. And so one of the things I want to get people to look at a little bit more is before you even look there, let's look at the ingredients, right? So what else do you see on that label? How many ingredients are you seeing? What is that? What are those first couple ingredients, which sort of correlate to being the thing that is the most abundant in that food? And so, and does it say whole grain or is it something that is refined? And these are things that we want to pay some attention to. And so, one of the big things when I do my talks, if people say, "Oh, it's too expensive to eat, sort of to eat this way," and I give them an example, usually of oatmeal. And so it's all about marketing. And marketing really gets, as we talked about before, that is something that happens a lot, which is marketing. And what we will see is that if you, those Quaker oats that come with like all of the flavoring, they're sort of marketed as instant. So they're easy. It's a package. You put it in a thing and you put it in the microwave and it's done, right? But this is, you turn around that package and I guarantee you're going to see a whole lot more than just organic whole grains. And the thought is that, oh, these are 6 in a box. It is, it's a very cheap price. It's not that big of a deal. But there's only 6 servings there, whereas you have about 19 servings, 20 servings in this thing, depending on how much you have each time, right? And that bag is far cheaper than that box of 6. And it's healthier for you with less ingredients, right? And you can add whatever else, your cinnamon or whatever you want to add to it, sort of on your end with your own fruit on top, rather than sort of these fruits that have been refined and dried and those sort of things. And so getting patients to sort of pay attention to sort of their protein intake, their fiber intake, whether there's added sugars, which you will see in sort of a lot of those processed things, and then sort of thinking about sort of the caloric intake and how much an actual serving is. But the big thing I get people to look at first is what does that ingredient label say?